Now, here at this church, we believe that God is the creative power, the creative mind within the individual. And Mr. Pritchard here in this wonderful production has let the creative mind of God bring forth this beautiful thing out of him. Mr. Pritchard is one of these very self-directed young men. He's also just receiving his master's degree, somewhat modest. He might not tell you that, so that's why I'm going to tell you. What school is that, Mr. Pritchard?
That's New York University.
And have you just receiving it, or you'll be receiving it in a few days? What is it?
I just received it this past Friday.
Come on, give him another great big hand. And this is a master's degree in what field now?
This is in theater arts.
In theater arts. Now, how about that? Now, East Side Story, again, from which the selection you heard just came, has created quite a sensation around here in New York because they've performed this production of this extravaganza, if you please, here once before. And some very wonderful people saw this musical, and they're so interested in it. So Mr. Pritchard came to me to talk to me about it the other day, and so I'll just tell you just a little bit of our conversation anyway, not the whole thing. One thing he said to me, he says, Reverend Ike, I've gotten a lot of wonderful offers concerning East Side Story, my musical. He said, should I sell it? I said to him, son, the first thing you do, you copyright it to be sure you own it first. Now, Benny, we want you to know that we're so happy to have you around this church and to have you working with the Creative Arts Workshop. And we're proud of you because you are an example to the whole world that you can be what you want to be, do what you want to do, and have what you want to have when you believe in yourself. And I love to see, in a particular way, self-directed young men, because there are too many young men today that are just throwing themselves to the dogs. But we're happy to say all are not, and Mr. Pritchard is a very good example. He's being so creative in his theatrical productions, and even sometime before he got his master's degree in theater arts, he's been producing musicals and so on. Now, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and what you've been doing?
Well, I started coming here in February, and I might say that all of my creative efforts had not begun to develop. And when I began to come here and I listened to what you were saying, I began to get my thoughts together creatively, more so through school and through my creative personality. And I might say I was very kind of bashful, I would say, trying to talk to people, and I began to know this God within me, and I began to know that I can do much more than I had thought I couldn't do. And as time went on, I began to write more songs to this musical, which had been written in Youngstown. However, in Ohio, it was done with other musical numbers that were not mine. And since that time, I wrote 16 numbers to put into this new musical since February.
Now, you talk about creativity. Those of you who are watching by television, you'll see this perhaps several months later. But let's give them the number of months. Now, how many months is that that you wrote 16 of the musical numbers for this production?
I would say about 4 months.
Now, that's pretty good. I'm glad he mentioned, too, that coming around here helped him because, you know, around here we're constantly teaching people what God is within them. And while he's saying this, and it comes to my mind because of what he's saying, I'm going to pass this to those of you who are here and those of you who are on television. Let's use this affirmation. God is the creative mind within me right here and right now. God is the creative mind within me right here and right now. And perhaps while Benny is talking to us, some of you who have had inspiration to do certain things, but you have not completed those things. Perhaps he will inspire you. Perhaps this thought will inspire you to let the creative mind of God, which is within you, work in you and through you and as you, remembering that God is the creative mind within me right here and right now. Let's say that together again. God is the creative mind within me right here and right now.
Reverend Ike, I would just like to add one thing. When I began to come to this creative workshop, Miss Fox and also Mr. Hendricks, they greeted me in such a way until I was part of the group just that first day. And I wanted to introduce this play, and Miss Fox already told me, she says, well, I think you'll be able to do it, won't you? And she didn't know whether or not this would make it or not, and she didn't know whether or not it was creative enough for the workshop, and this goes to show that you can determine whether or not something can go on if you really see it yourself. And it's such a beautiful thing because you begin to know yourself and you don't settle for one thing. I am a singer as well as a playwright, but I don't settle for one thing because you can do so many things once you find out this God within you, and you can just not limit yourself to one thing.
Wow. I think he's beginning to preach too. Because God is infinite. Here again we can say God is the infinite creative mind within me. Come on. God is the infinite creative mind within me. Mr. Pritchard said that once he really discovered this presence, this creative mind of God within him, he was able to write 16 numbers for this musical in a number of months, and he found out that he could do more than he thought he could do. And this always happens when you acknowledge God in you. Now, some people may be asking, oh, Reverend Ike, I've got some good ideas, I have some inspiration that I would like to bring forth, but how can I contact the creative mind of God in me? From the book of Proverbs, this gives you a cue. The book of Proverbs says, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. It's that simple. Just acknowledge that the presence of God is within you, and it will begin to work in you and through you. Just acknowledge that the creative mind of God is within you, and it will begin to work wonders in you, through you, and as you. That's all. So those of you who hear me for the first time in this congregation now, and those of you who are looking into the telecast for the first time, you can begin a new creative experience in your life simply by realizing that God is the creative mind within me right here, right now. Let's say it again, it's worth it. God is the creative mind within me right here, right now. All right, Benny, I'll be cutting into your statements. You know, that's the way I preach. I preach sermons from life. That's why we call this telecast The Joy of Living. I'm not up here to tell you what James and John and Peter and Paul did. I'm here to tell you what you can do right here, right now.
I often hear people say, and especially you, Reverend Ike, about to use your mind. I didn't know exactly how to present my thesis and what statement I was going to use as a thesis for this master's degree. And I began to use my mind with this play of East Side Story, since it had been rewritten and revised, etc., etc. I began to use this to my professors, and I said, why not use this as a thesis? And I used this as 1/2 part of a thesis and receive a grade of A.
How about that? Well, I'll tell you, mind power works. Say that with me. Mind power works. And this is really what I mean when I use my old slang, you can't lose with the stuff I use. A lot of people say, what is Reverend Ike talking about? Well, honey, the stuff I use is mind power. Let me hear you say that with me. Mind power. That's the stuff I use. And Mr. Pritchard here says that he used this concept of mind power that we teach in writing his thesis for his master's degree, and it worked for him. Isn't that wonderful? I'd like to point out another thing also, because many people who come from a fundamentalistic religious background will say, oh, Reverend Ike is always talking about that old mind science. Why doesn't he preach from the Bible? The Bible is the greatest book of mind science that there ever was. And you good people, whether you realize it or not, the Apostle Paul was one of the greatest practitioners of mind science. In St. Paul's letter to the Romans in the 12th chapter, he said, "Be you transformed by the renewing of your mind." In other words, if you want to change anything in your life, first of all, do what? Change your mind. Change your way of thinking. And you're not going to get very far in this world until you learn how to use your mind power. And that's what we're all about around here, mind power.